It has been 2 years, or just over 2 years, of February 24th of 2022. Russia, under President Vladimir Putin, launched a full-scale ground invasion of Ukraine, and this is a development that has upended in many ways, the international order, that has exacerbated regional instability, and has raised a host of concerns 2 years later that continue to persist regarding the prospects for bringing this conflict to an end. It has been a devastating conflict, and even though in the last few months, perhaps in the last 6 months, we have seen a decrease in the attention, at least in the Western media, that this conflict is getting, it is no less deadly. Estimates vary, but according to very authoritative estimates, there have been between killed and injured more than 500,000 casualties in the most recent Ukraine conflict starting in 2004. President Zelensky recently spoke of more than 30,000 Ukrainian soldiers killed, although some observers consider that to be an understatement, and the figure could be as high as 70,000, or twice as many that have been killed. Estimates put the number of killed on the Russian side at least 150,000. Recently, in February of this year, the United Nations Human Rights Monitoring Mission in Ukraine said that aside from military personnel, there have been at least 30,000 civilian casualties on the Ukrainian side. So the humanitarian toll really is staggering, and it continues to grow by the day. This is an area of concern for Project Ploughshares for several reasons, not least because it exacerbates regional instability and global insecurity, but also because it relates to some of the specific files that we follow at Project Ploughshares related to the arms trade. And we have seen an increase in the flow of arms to Ukraine and a resurgence of the global arms industry as a result. It relates to nuclear disarmament and nuclear risk, and we have seen that nuclear risks have been exacerbated and continue to be at an all-time high because of the Ukraine conflict. It concerns us because of the protection of civilians, and we have witnessed a catastrophic and devastating pattern of harm in Ukraine that continues to this day. For the record, Project Ploughshares has commented on this conflict in the past. We have hosted webinars, we have written op-eds, etc. Two things I would highlight about Project Ploughshares' position. One, we have recognized with no ambiguity that the Russian incursion in Ukraine has been illegal, has been disruptive, and has had tremendously negative humanitarian consequences and security implications. And secondly, and we don't see this as being mutually exclusive, we have gone on record calling for the consideration of a negotiated settlement as a way to end the conflict. Having said that, we are aware that there are different views on the way forward and what the end game might be. On the one hand, to oversimplify admittedly a little bit, there are those who still pursue or argue for the pursuit of a military victory, a decisive military victory, and basically defeating Russia on the battlefield, and arguing that the alternative would be to appease this sort of unacceptable aggression from Russia. On the other, there are those who say that there is a lack of clarity about the endgame, that a military win by either side is increasingly unlikely, and that even though it is not a pretty scenario for many or an ideal scenario, sooner or later, there will need to be a recognition for the need to negotiate, to come to the table and negotiate. But even among those within this camp of negotiations, there are questions about the nature of the negotiations, the parties involved, the issues to be discussed, and the extent of the concessions that may or may not be made by either side. So ultimately, the question that informs our our webinar today has to do with the notion of the end game. This is a catastrophic conflict. The carnage is unbearable. So there is a question of how will this end? What is the most realistic and likely scenario under which this might come to an end? And for this, we have the absolute privilege of having three remarkable experts on this topic. They've each given it a lot of thought. They have experience. They have written on it. They have firsthand observations of many of the dynamics that precede this conflict. And we are very keen to hear their perspectives on this. So I will start, and we will try to have a relatively dynamic panel in the next hour, and we encourage and welcome questions from the audience, and you can type them. And near the end of the panel, we will find an opportunity to address some of these to our esteemed panelists. I will not go into lengthy introductions, but let me just recognize that we have Seva Gunitsky, who is a professor of political science at the University of Toronto and a well-recognized expert in this field, who has commented prolifically on this conflict and other related matters. And Seva, thank you for joining us. We have my very good friend and colleague, Peggy Mason, who's the president of the Rideau Institute, a friend of Project Ploughshares and frequent collaborator, and a former Canadian ambassador for Disarmament. And we have Ambassador Chris Shapardanov, who is a senior associate at David Pratt and Associates. He's a former Canadian ambassador to Finland, and in addition to that, had a long and illustrious career at Global Affairs Canada. So to each of you, thank you for joining us and for sharing your expertise. So I will begin, and I will ask basically the same question to each of you. And it relates to what I just said earlier about the most likely and realistic scenario under which this conflict might end. And I note the key caveat is that likely and realistic may not be the same as ideal. But I do feel that the situation calls for a certain degree of pragmatism about what is doable, what is possible, and what the current situation might dictate. So why don't we start with you, Seva? How might this conflict end?
Well, thanks first of all for having me here, and thank you, Cesar, for that very kind introduction. I'll talk about pragmatic things at the end of my answer, but let me start with sort of the bad news. And that is that in the short term, it's very hard to see a scenario that would bring either a durable peace agreement or even a temporary ceasefire. And so the most likely outcome is continued stalemate this year. And I would say there are three factors really that are pushing against an end to the fighting. One is that simply Kyiv and Moscow have very different ideas of what makes an acceptable peace deal right now. It's kind of mutually exclusive. They just don't line up in their demands. Both sides have proposed peace deals, and both have flatly rejected the other side's conditions. So at least for the moment, there's little overlap between their demands. And the reasons are well known. The Kremlin has made it clear that the only negotiated end it can accept is surrender by Ukraine of some sort. We can get into what that means. And the Ukrainians have made it equally clear that they will keep fighting, that they don't want to be part of the Ruski Mir, the Russian world. And when Putin talks about ending the war, he still talks about things like denazification, which is really code for regime change, demilitarization, and Ukrainian neutrality. And these are they're presented as non-negotiable. Whether they are negotiable remains to be seen. But at least on their face, the terms are not acceptable to Zelensky or even many of his Western allies. Because an acceptable deal for Russia would mean full control of the Ukrainian regions they claim are Russian. And these are not terms Ukraine is willing to accept. Nor can Zelensky even accept them, even if he wanted to, because politically there would be a huge political price he would have to pay. And of course, Kyiv's peace deal right now is demanding the 1991 borders back. For Putin, this means rolling back everything Russia has achieved since 2014, so a complete non-starter. So that's one. Now, the second factor is more short-term, which is that Russia has some momentum on its side, or at least it has the perception of momentum. It's captured Avdiivka, despite extremely heavy losses. It's touting it as a textbook example. I think it will be in textbooks, but not for the reason they think. They continue to make a push into nearby villages. And, let's face the facts. There are shortages of munitions, shortages of manpower on the Ukrainian side. There are serious doubts about U.S. commitment. And there's the perception that Russia will do whatever it takes to push the advantage, including sustaining heavy losses and calling it a victory. And I think more generally, if you look at, even looking at Russian media, which I do occasionally, although I don't recommend it too much, the country is on a war footing, right? Putin has placed the country on a war footing. And there's a good chance that he believes the war has been good for him and his country. And I think this is a starting assumption that maybe we have not yet internalized, and we need to. And if Putin thinks things are going his way, that gives him very little short-term reason to press for an end to the fighting. And he might also be waiting to see what happens in the U.S., although I don't want to stress the role of the U.S. too much. He might be hoping that the next U.S. president will stop support for Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
And the third, and I'll end on this, the biggest problem preventing the emergence of a durable peace is what political scientists call the commitment problem. How can one party here credibly commit to abide by the terms of a peace agreement in the future, even if they find room for negotiation? There's no third party to credibly enforce it. How can Putin be trusted to abide by the terms of the peace deal rather than use it as a pause to lock in gains and a prelude to more fighting? And of course, Russian conduct during the war has undermined any trust Ukraine might have in Russian promises and also made it less likely to give up territory, because that means accepting war crimes and accepting ethnic cleansing in occupied territory. So Putin has made it clear that he doesn't consider Ukraine a sovereign country. How can you negotiate with something like that? And if the war is entrenched in imperial objectives and an ideology, that leaves little room for negotiation. So the most likely scenario is continuation. And let me just end by saying what is the most likely possibility for peace? There are some possibilities for peace. They are unlikely, but they're not all equally unlikely. And the most likely of those would be a ceasefire of some sort prompted by a stalemate. Even if Ukraine can't get a major advantage, it can still do a lot just by keeping Russian casualties very high and denying easy grounds. The Russian military is adapting, we can see it, but Putin wants loyalty above everything else. He certainly wants loyalty above innovation. He's kept on Shoigu, and the strategy remains the same: throw bodies at the problem. So Ukraine can take that defensive posture and can keep up disrupting Russian logistics, hitting factories, hitting even ships, imposing costs. And if the Ukraine switches to a defensive stance, the line stalemate, then the possibility of a ceasefire becomes more feasible. But right now, mutually exclusive demands, Russian optimism, commitment problem, all of these together means there's little space in the short term for peace negotiations.
Thank you, Seva. That's a fabulous answer. I mean, and very concise and clear. And as you were saying, it made me think really of the difficult obstacles that remain. So one might infer from what you say, not to put words in your mouth. I mean, at least in 2024, which is just getting started, you're not optimistic that this conflict will come to an end. Is that fair?
Yes, in the short term. It's extremely hard to make predictions about Russia, and we've been wrong before, but at least in the short term, it looks like there's no end in sight.
There's no end. Okay. Thank you so much once again. Peggy, same question, over to you. What do you think might be the most likely scenario and realistic scenario under which this conflict might come to an end?
Thank you very much. Well, I mean, to cut to the absolute bottom line, I think the only way this conflict can end and the only way it will end is through a negotiated settlement. And the issue is when. And I sincerely hope that it's sooner rather than, for the sake of Ukraine, that it's sooner rather than later. We'll be talking about the commitment problem later on. But just to say now that if in fact it's that dire, then it would suggest that no meaningful arms control agreements would be possible between the US and Russia. And I just don't think that's true. And I think the evidence is contrary to that. But anyway, to get back to the question at hand, neither Russia, and to sort of do a little summary before I go into a little more detail, neither Russia nor Ukraine can achieve not only their stated maximalist goals, but also even key or essential goals on the battlefield. Ukraine risks more and more the longer the war goes on, and there'll be more discussion on that later. Russia cannot achieve key goals like a neutral Ukraine, a big step down from its maximalist goal of a demilitarized Ukraine, without a negotiated settlement. And Ukraine can only achieve enough to guarantee its prosperity and security going forward, which really requires making progress towards EU accession through a negotiated settlement, only through a negotiated settlement. So logic and sanity dictate to both sides that this war should end through negotiations. But that's by no means certain, at least in the foreseeable future. But I see the reason as very, very different from, of course, Russia will take advantage of the current military situation if it can, but I think it's more interested in some of its key goals. And so I think, and I'm going to mention a little bit about, I mean, we've got another signal revealed yesterday, very strong one about Russian willingness to negotiate. So I think the absolute obstacle, what's holding everything up, is the Western narrative. It must climb down. The West must climb down, but it's not easy. From its consistent propaganda narrative since the beginning of the conflict, that there must be total victory for Ukraine, or Russia will be emboldened to go on a rampage against even NATO countries. The total victory for Ukraine is starting to wear very thin with publics, as polling, and I'll get to that in a minute. US polling, I'm not going to get into European polling. That's a more complicated picture. But the key to negotiations at this stage is change in US position. So the starting point is Ukraine cannot prevail in this war. That's the maximalist goal. And I use the term prevail because that's what the G7 leaders in their February 24 statement said. They talked about Ukraine prevailing. Ukrainian territory held by Russia is almost identical to what it was a year ago, 18% of its territory under 1991 borders. And I would argue that it's not a stalemate, actually. That's putting it in the best terms for Ukraine. I think that in fact it's not a stalemate. They're staying in the game because they've switched to a defensive strategy, but time is not on their side. And talking about what Russia's been able to do, it's not just what it's been able to do militarily, I mean, with respect to military production. Partial mobilization, adding 300,000 troops, putting Russian factories on a war footing, but digging in the Donbass and the South, that is switching to this, what's called an attrition strategy that relies, which is why I'm arguing it's not a stalemate. And of course, I'm not a military expert and spend a lot of time around military experts, but I'm certainly not one. But relying on military experts whose views I trust, that this attrition strategy relies on Russia's numerical advantages in population and military production. And that's why time is simply not on Ukraine's side. It has few apparent means to regain the battlefield initiative and force Russian capitulation. Large quantities of US weapons supplied to Ukraine in the counteroffensive did not help Ukraine to break through Russian lines. And only a shift, as I've said, to a defensive strategy has kept Ukraine from losing more ground. And all of this will be true whatever the level of Western military aid, which of course is a subject of grave concern at the moment. So I think that those urging long war with continued Western support in Western supplies are underestimating the increasing problem Ukraine has with manpower. Sorry?
No, please go ahead, Peggy.
Sorry. Okay. Now, I'll say right now that absolutely key to making sure that Russia does come to the negotiating table is continued Western military support. And therefore, it's not a good thing at all that there's so much trouble in Washington on that issue. But even if the worst case scenario of Ukraine military collapse does not happen and continued Western aid is essential to prevent this disaster, Ukraine is suffering terribly so long as it stays at war. And notably, it's moving further and further away from meeting the conditions for entry into the EU, its best hope for a stable, prosperous, and secure future. And I know Seva is going to touch on that more later. But, all of this recent discussion of, and then war does this, about loss of democratic freedoms and Zelensky becoming an autocrat and on and on. I mean, this is moving them away from where they have to be going, not to mention the extraordinary devastation to the economy. Okay, so the bottom line is they cannot prevail and they risk losing more and more as long as the conflict proceeds. So then we come to the question, why would Russia negotiate? And I touched on that a little bit at the beginning, and I'm going on here, but I think it's very, very, very important to consider what the incentives that Russia has to negotiate, which is why I think they've been sending out very clear signals, including the latest from Reuters about actual talks through intermediaries in Turkey in late 2023, early 2024. But Russia, I mean, it faces without a negotiated settlement, occupying lands it has annexed, with the ongoing threat of attacks and sabotage. It requires at least de facto Western acquiescence of its control of Crimea and the Donbass if it's going to be able to do anything with that. And then there's the long-standing pre-invasion concern about the West supplying long-range strike capability to Ukraine. I mean, that was part of its whole concern about Ukraine joining NATO. So that is, again, something that cannot be solved on the battlefield. Now, on the maximalist claim for Russia is denazification. Turning that into something, you know, and of course, the war has exacerbated the problem of Ukrainian ethno-nationalism. I mean, Putin is only himself to blame for that. But EU accession will address the issue because it's a minority rights issue. So, and even modest CBMs and arms control measures require a settlement. So, to wind this up, there's also Russia's increasing dependence on China, which it's clearly chafing at. They're not coterminous in their interests. Now, so this all leads to a negotiation. But the question is, will the West take advantage of the leverage that it has right now when the situation, by many analysts, is what Seva has said, a stalemate? I don't agree with that, but nonetheless, many analysts argue that the West has leverage right now. Are they going to take advantage of it and take serious efforts to negotiate sooner rather than later, which basically means the United States going to start taking negotiation more seriously instead of frantically denying that there were any direct talks in this latest revelation by Reuters of the back channel talks. And as I said, I don't have the answer to that question. And we haven't really had a good public pressure on this. So there's that dynamic to consider, which we haven't really had yet beyond polling. But I wouldn't bet a lot of money on this happening sooner rather than later. But it needs to, and I hope it does.
Thank you, Peggy. Lots of great insight there. And I think a key takeaway would be, for me, this notion that neither side will be able to reach its maximalist goals. And I think that relates directly to the question of when, and perhaps if one takes that as a premise, it's one possible answer is when will leaders, or political and military and otherwise, recognize this? You know, that there are limits to what can be achieved in the battlefield, and therefore be compelled to negotiations. Later on in the discussion, Peggy and others, perhaps we can come to the point of, you know, we hear this narrative that is the end game is for Ukraine and Ukrainians exclusively to determine. But at the same time, all these references to the West and Western cheerleading and Western arms and Western propaganda. So to be concrete, you know, is it really just for Ukraine and Ukrainians to determine, or is it more in Washington to make a determination of when conditions might be ripe for negotiations? But we can come back to that. Ambassador Shapardanov, I would come to you with the same general question. What do you foresee as the end game in this conflict? And if you care to venture a timeline of when this might happen, that would be most welcome.
I think Seva outlined the issues quite well, quite articulately. I agree that Ukrainians at the moment are in no mood for negotiated settlement. All you have to do is recall the atrocities that took place at Bucha and Irpin, and you can see Ukrainians know full well what the implications are of the Ruski Mir, and they want no part of that. And that's why they're striving to move toward Europe. And I think that's what caused Putin to take action against Ukraine, because he saw their paths diverging. I really do not see a situation where the Ukrainians would not fight quite vigorously to defend their 1991 borders. And I think it's really up to the West to help the Ukrainians achieve that goal. Otherwise, we are rewarding aggression. That would be a blow to the rules-based international order. That I think, you know, the ramifications of that would trickle right around the globe, because borders must be treated as sacrosanct and not movable by force, because borders make no sense in many places around the world. And an aggressor can make any, you know, as Putin has an idiosyncratic interpretation of history to justify what is essentially an imperialistic aggression against Ukraine. And we see that in doing that, he's had to reach out to, you know, what some people are calling the axis of autocracy. He's getting support from countries like North Korea and Iran, if not China. And, you know, these arsenals of autocracy, if you will, as someone has coined the phrase, are now tipping the scale in Russia's favor, and you're seeing battlefield success. And it's unfortunate that the arsenals of democracy have been relatively quiescent. Yes, there's been a flood of support to Ukraine, mostly older weapons and less capable second-line weapons. And it's time to provide the Ukrainians with better capability to defend themselves under Article 51 of the United Nations Charter. This is fully allowed. So I think we should be actually doing more to help Ukraine protect itself and to advance its interests on the battlefield. So I'll stop there because we can cover some of the other points.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, and I think you've articulated very well the notion of what the border, the implication of the borders, you know, might be in any eventual settlement of this conflict, because even those who call for a decisive and believe in a decisive military victory, there may be more than one view on what that actually entails in practice. Is it a military defeat of the Russian armed forces? Is it reclaiming the most recently occupied territories? Is it going back to 2014 Crimea? Is it like, how far back does one go and to achieve what might be acceptable for Ukrainians to come to the negotiating table? So I think those insights will be quite instructive for us. So let's go back to the notion of a ceasefire, Peggy, if you don't mind. I mean, what needs to happen for a ceasefire negotiation to happen? And I'll go back to a comment I made just after you spoke. I mean, is the crux of the matter, in at least from not from the Ukrainian side, to be decided in Kyiv or in Washington for when conditions might be right for negotiation? What needs to happen for this objective to be realized? Who needs to be persuaded?
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I mean, I have to be very blunt here. A reality check here. Ukraine is staying in the game because it has adopted a defensive strategy. You do not take new ground with a defensive strategy. That in itself is a glaring indication that it cannot prevail in the war. And actually, we got some rather interesting evidence of that in this latest evidence of the gap between the Western narrative and reality in this recent kerfuffle that President Macron of France caused when he was talking about ruling out, when he said he would not rule out Western NATO troops in the war, which led, of course, to a huge kerfuffle, as I said, and Stoltenberg saying this wasn't on the table. But the commentary has missed the important point that unlike the G7 leaders' statement, which talked about supporting Ukraine until it prevailed, Macron said that he would not rule out Western troops in the war to prevent Russia from winning. So I think there's your reality check on, oh, you know, borders can't be changed by force. Of course, we don't. We would rather that not be the case. But we're talking about what in reality can be done in this situation. And again, talking about the rules-based order, the UN Charter has Article 51, sure, but it also has the requirement for the peaceful resolution of disputes. And if the Security Council weren't directly involved in this conflict through Russia and the United States, the Security Council, you can be sure, would be calling for negotiations in this case. So, but a very, very, very important point has been brought up by both my fellow panelists, an extremely important one, and that is the completely viscerally understandable antipathy of Ukraine to negotiations. And experts like Anatol Levin, for example, believe that were Zelensky independently himself to call for negotiations, he would open himself up to potentially destabilizing attacks from Ukraine's political right wing. And in fact, he believes it's highly improbable that Zelensky or any Ukrainian president could survive initiating talks with Russia absent public pressure from Washington on which to pin the blame. So that, of course, is answering your question about whether it's Washington or Ukraine. It's that if Ukraine is ever going to get into a negotiation, it needs Washington's help. But Washington has tied itself in knots. So we've got a Ukrainian ban on negotiations, and we've got an American position that there will be nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine. So, you know, each side has tied it up itself. And I mean, I think the Ukrainian position is entirely understandable. I think Biden tying himself up in this way is completely reprehensible, because it ties him up in a way where he can't help when help is help on the non-military front. I mean, he's not helping. They're not helping on the military front as much as they should, and now they're not helping on the non-military front. And this has led to this, as I alluded to, this incredible story this week from Reuters, where Russia said that they had offered to pursue a ceasefire along the current front lines in conversations held in late 2023 and early 2024, including a round of unofficial talks in Turkey. And they also talked about some Mideast partners being involved. And of course, Turkey's been involved in the past and is in this very interesting position of being in NATO, but having this relationship with Russia. But the United States' only response was to deny that there was official contact between Moscow and Washington. Now, Moscow hadn't actually said they'd said it had been through intermediaries. And the United States repeated its position, it would only agree to negotiations involving Ukraine. I mean, obviously Ukraine has to be involved in the negotiations, although but getting the negotiations going, trying to, get a process going, it does not necessarily mean that Ukraine has to be initially involved, especially when they can't. And it's also worth pointing out that there are many, many issues that go beyond Ukraine, European security issues that go beyond Ukraine and Russia, and therefore another reason why others have to be involved. So the issue becomes and the question to me is, how do we get movement? How do we get to a ceasefire? And I take that to mean not what the outcome of that would be, but literally, how do we get to a ceasefire negotiation? And as I think that requires movement from the US. And conventional wisdom is that the Biden administration won't do anything in the lead up to the presidential election in November 2024. But I think that conventional wisdom should be looked at again, because polling is showing, and this is a very, very recent poll, showing that 70% of Americans want a negotiated peace. And when a follow-up question is given to them saying, well, that means compromise, 57% still support it. And
Right.
astute American political analysts also say that Putin is not as toxic in Washington as heretofore. I mean, we know the whole MAGA crowd, he never was toxic with them, but with the sort of conservative, the anti-Russian conservative base, they're kind of signaling, basically, by the way they're behaving on the funding bill, that the anti sort of Russia bipartisan cause is no longer there.
Right.
Which
Thank you, Peggy.
I'm just going to say one more thing, which means there is a window of opportunity, but Biden himself needs some face saving here. And so we have, and I'll end at this point, we have an announcement today that China is getting back in. They had put out their peace plan, which was principles and objectives, which the West paid no attention to at the time, although there was nothing objectionable in either the principles, which were UN international law, or the objectives, because they didn't set out, any detail that either side could object to. But anyway,
Right.
they have signaled that they want to get back into the game, and they're going to pursue another round of peace talks. So that may be enough. I would argue if Biden wants to take that, he can use that, because there's certainly a bipartisan anti-China view in Washington. So he can parlay the increased Chinese interest into at least back channel talks with Russia.
Thank you, Peggy. Thank you.
Okay.
Thank you. And certainly we need to see what the impact of China's renewed interest, because as you rightly noted, they had already put forth some principles and objectives, aimed at resolution, but they've mostly, one might argue, been in the background up until now. So we'll see if this portends, further increasing involvement. Back to you, Chris. I mean, if you had to identify a couple of obstacles that you would like to see overcome, in order to move forward in this crisis, however you define progress, whether through military victory or through getting closer to negotiations, what might be two obstacles or a couple of obstacles that you identify are critical in being able to overcome at this point?
Well, the main obstacle is Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin stops this war, it's over, right? If Ukraine stops this war, there's no more Ukraine. It's an existential issue. Vladimir Putin wants to roll back the clock to the security structure in Europe pre-1997, right? That means Poland, Hungary, Czech Republic, Slovakia, the Baltic states are not part of NATO. That means Russia is dominant in NATO, in Europe, right? And therefore free to pursue its imperialistic agenda, right? And that cannot be allowed to stand. None of those countries, in the negotiation of the response to that proposal that Lavrov put forward to NATO in the months before February 22, there's unanimous agreement within the alliance that this was just ridiculous, right? There's no way that we can go back to that, right? So that has to be clear, that is just not on.
And assuming that President Putin, is you consider to be, perhaps the key or a key obstacle, might one infer from that position that peace is not possible or very unlikely as long as Putin is president? Is that a corollary of that position?
That is correct. Yes, he sees himself as a modern czar, right? And if you look at Russian history, czars, part of their legacy was to bequeath to their successor an expanded empire. Putin wants to bequeath to his unidentified successor a larger Russia, or it's also consistent with people like Catherine the Great, who talked about my country has no natural borders, so I have to keep expanding them. I don't know if you saw in last year's first anniversary, there were posters in Moscow that said Russia's borders have no end. Vladimir Putin, right? Like, so this is the kind of imperialistic ambition that is there, and it has to be extirpated. It took World War II to defeat German fascism and Japanese militarism. we really do have to defeat Russia in Ukraine. And the Ukrainians have shown that they can expel the Russians from their territory. They expelled them out of Kiev, out of Kharkiv, out of Kherson, right? The Ukrainians,
ancient
because
history
they are,
now.
just a second,
You want some
because
interaction.
they are facing an existential threat, they are achieving things that are defying what people thought, right? We didn't think they could expel them from Kharkiv. We didn't think they'd be stopped, that the Russians would be stopped in Kiev, right? There's Snake Island, there's the Moskva, there's the losses that the Black Sea Fleet is sustaining. The Ukrainians have switched. It was never thought that a country could switch from Warsaw Pact ammunition and logistics standards to a NATO standard system of logistics and ammunition. So Ukrainians have done it. They're moving to F-15 fighters, F-16, sorry, not F-15, F-16 fighters, which could make a significant difference on the battlefield. Progress on the ground has been obstructed because the Ukrainians do not have air superiority as much as they need to break through the Russian lines. And let's keep in mind the Crimean Bridge is vulnerable to Ukrainian attack, as we have seen. So I don't think we should underestimate Ukrainians' ability to achieve their objectives, especially when they are given the weapons they deserve to have from the Western Alliance, including Canada.
Thank you for those insights. And let me throw 2 words back at you, Chris, if you don't mind, that, as everybody knows, are quite loaded in international policy discussions. Regime change. And I just want to follow the logical progression of identifying, Putin as a key obstacle. I mean, if that is the assumption that Putin, and there can be no peace with Putin, or as long as Putin is president, should that be an implied or a stated goal of the West going forward?
We don't need to use regime change, right? First of all, let me just amplify one point. Putin's word is not worth the paper it's written on, right? We saw the Minsk agreements that came after Crimea was attacked in 2014. What happened with those? They were not implemented, and the Russians bided their time only to prepare for a wider attack on Ukraine. That is exactly the scenario that will be repeated if there is a ceasefire along the line of contact that recognizes the facts on the ground now. So I don't think the Ukrainians are going to go for that twice. That absolutely makes no sense, and the West should not go for that either, because this has implications for European security, and the Chinese are watching with respect to Taiwan. So a military defeat, because Putin is identified so personally with this war, a defeat of Russia in Ukraine will undermine his credibility domestically. There is a cost being borne by the Russians internally. Their $1 billion a day they're getting from oil revenue and bumper crops that they're selling to DPRK in exchange for weapons. Yes, the regime has staying power, but it is becoming more and more difficult. So their staying power will reduce over time. And I think let's hope that Putin's drive will stop in Ukraine, and he will not divert his attention, let's say, into the Caucasus or Central Asia, if he manages to maintain his grip on power because of his autocratic and heavy intelligence supported regime that he has.
Okay, well, yeah, great insights, and thanks for expanding on that point, because even on year 1, I remember when the first anniversary, a lot of people, betting, so to speak, on Putin's downfall for internal domestic reasons or because of the war, but the reality is that hasn't happened. And on the other side, on the Russian side, some people betting that the appetite in the West for continued support, including military support, for the war enterprise, if you will, might wane before Putin's government is in jeopardy. So it's like a bit of wishful thinking, perhaps, on both sides.
Putin is definitely betting that Western appetite for support for Ukraine will fade. There's no doubt about that.
Okay, thank you. Seva, I mean, you very clearly identify, this notion of how mutually exclusive ultimately at this point the objectives are on either side, and how Russia has some of the momentum and that may delay, the prospect of a negotiation. But assuming we do get there this year or soon after, there's this notion of security assurances. At the end of the day, negotiations imply, I think, by definition, some level of compromise. I mean, what are some key ones, with regard to Ukraine and similarly with regard to Russia, that they might walk away with a, face-saving attitude and say, okay, we accomplished something out of these negotiations? What might be security assurances in that context?
Yeah, well, it's tricky. I think even the term security assurances might be a little misleading here, or at least it doesn't really capture that the two sides are facing two very different threats or two different ranges of outcome. So Ukraine needs security assurances because its existence as a state is threatened by Russia. Russia does not need security assurances. Russian national security is not threatened by Ukraine. What it does seek to achieve is the prevention of Ukraine integrating into the West. But how can Ukraine credibly commit to that? How can the West credibly commit to something like that? I think the question we could ask is, who is even able to provide the kinds of assurances that Russia or Ukraine would seek? And who would be able to provide them credibly in the eyes of those two participants? I can't think of many. Would Russia trust the US to negotiate a deal? I mean, yes, the US will have to be involved, but that level of trust right now is not there. A third party, Saudi Arabia, China, what credibility do they offer here? And this goes back to the commitment problem I mentioned. In the absence of an external enforcer, a credible external enforcement mechanism, there's simply no way to provide for those assurances in a credible way to either side. Not to mention, of course, Ukraine already received security assurances in 1994 in the Budapest Memorandum. That did not do it any good. It's looking for more than vague assurances this time.
Right.
The
And this
only
notion.
real, so, and
Please
I'll
go
just
ahead.
end there. One last thing. The only real security guarantee, as opposed to security assurance, is NATO membership. And that's not going to happen as long as the war goes on. And
You read
perhaps
my
another
mind
reason for
because
Putin to continue the war.
you read my mind because I was I want to press a little bit on that, because when you made a reference to further integration into the West, what comes to mind is, of course, this notion of Ukraine joining NATO. Is that feasible, realistic, conducive to peace, or might it have the opposite effect and exacerbate tensions even further if they continue pursuing that path?
Well, it's certainly not going to happen while the war is happening, right? It would just be impossible. And I see that Chris actually has got a question about Ukraine joining NATO, and I'm sure he has strong opinions. So I'm happy to defer in the interest of time to him on that question.
Okay, Chris, we welcome your perspective on this.
Yes. So I'm a former
thank you,
member of the international staff at NATO, and I was involved in some of the first meetings of the NATO Ukraine Commission back in the late 90s in Kiev, for example. But yeah, so Seb is absolutely right. There's no prospect of Ukraine joining NATO when there's a conflict going on. But the Secretary General said in his statement on Friday, Ukraine, it's not a question of if, it's only a question of when Ukraine will join NATO. And I think that's very important. I think it's important for a couple of things that I'd like to emphasize just briefly. First of all, it will establish now the western border of Russia. This gets back to the point. What are the borders of Russia, right? Putin keeps wanting to expand the borders of Russia. The borders will be Norway, Finland, Baltic states, Ukraine, and then there's Turkey on the other side of the Black Sea, right? So that's the barrier. No further Russian expansion. I think it's also good because it will signal the end of Russian imperialism. The Russian Empire will be over. There will only be Russia left as a country. And Zbigniew Brzezinski, I think, talked about this in the early 1990s. Russia has to go back to being a country, not an empire. Once imperialism is extirpated from the Russian political culture, they can get back to working on establishing democracy in Russia. That is the important thing. Let's hope, as I mentioned, that once, the Bolshevik line from Lenin was keep pushing until you hit something hard. What's hard is NATO membership, because the alliance will defend every inch of its territory, right? Putin recognizes that. So if he withstands a loss in Ukraine and remains in power, let's hope, as I said, he doesn't turn his imperialism elsewhere. And let's hope it leads to his demise. There's a prospect that an even more conservative leader, such as people from the intelligence services, would succeed him. And they bounce along what I call the tried and untrue ways for Russians until they realize, there's this reform revanchist cycle in Russian history that we've seen. And they are now in this period of stagnation, and they have to realize that they're going down the wrong path. They've driven themselves 30 years back in terms of their economic development. If they're ever going to get to a standard of living that would get anywhere near that of the West, maybe even China, they have to move forward to promote democracy and further economic reform. And that's what I think the benefits of having Ukraine in NATO will be for Russia, to get rid of that imperialism, which is in fact preventing their political development.
And do you think, Chris, in your estimation, that it's a matter of time before Ukraine joins NATO?
Yes, it is a matter of time. Ukraine wants to join NATO, right? This is just like all the Baltic states.
Right, but that Russia, even under a leadership that is not with President Putin, would, quote unquote, allow that to happen?
They have no say in the matter whatsoever. Okay. I mean, I saw this when I was ambassador in Finland. There's a Russian defense minister who came into Finland and said, you shouldn't be exercising Finland with NATO. You should be exercising with us. And the Finns had different views on that, right?
Right.
And you saw what happened. Finland and Sweden moved very quickly after February 2022 to join NATO. These were neutral countries, right? And they made the decision. I used to say this when I was in Finland. Geography is not destiny. Your neighbor does not decide your political military alliances, right? Every one of these countries has a right to join the Western family of institutions, including the EU, which Ukraine needs to do, and NATO. Right.
Okay, thank you for that. Seva, do you place any? There's a comment here from Doug Roach pointing to to the Secretary General of the United Nations and the United Nations as a forum that may provide the right framework for diplomatic solutions to be pursued. Do you have any faith in the international system itself, like aside from the specific parties in conflict right now? Do you think that there may be successful mediation efforts or diplomatic efforts conducted, under the auspices of the United Nations, for instance, or is the gridlock in the Security Council, sort of almost a recipe for non-action?
I mean, you said it yourself. There's very little room for action. There's little space for credibility from the UN on this when it comes to negotiating a peace. And I think what we're facing is possibility of a frozen conflict, really, whether or not the UN gets involved. People keep saying that wars must end in negotiations. That's not exactly true. The former Soviet space has lots of frozen conflicts. They can last many years, and this is not good for Ukraine. It creates pressure on Ukraine, allows Putin to keep squeezing. So I agree with Chris that the best way towards peace is to allow Ukraine the means to defend itself and to impose costs on Russia until the benefits of a ceasefire become hard to deny from a Russian perspective.
Okay, thank you. And Peggy, I mean, we have a comment here from Robin, citing John Mearsheimer and sort of prediction that the war might end if Putin controls a part of Ukrainian territory, not all of it, but a certain percentage of the territory. Do you think, recognizing the dictionary distinction between ideal and realistic, do you think there may be such a thing as an acceptable compromise for peace in the name of peace, whereby Ukraine in practice relinquishes control over a certain territory, and that is formalized.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that. I just want to make a comment on the security assurance versus guarantee, because I think this is very, very, very important. As Seva rightly pointed out, the security assurances, we've seen the weakness of security assurances. Basically, what Ukraine had before was a guarantee, that was a commitment that the Security Council would take up the issue, and we all know that where that's going to lead with a divided Security Council. And so what Ukraine actually talked about, what's in the early negotiations, was security guarantee. And what I think they meant was, or what one can turn that into, and some experts have, is a guarantee of compliance. And because of course Russia, as Seva rightly said, they don't need security assurances or guarantees of the kind that Ukraine needs. What Ukraine needs is a guarantee of Russian compliance. I mean, and that is where the role of China potentially becomes very important, because
as a guarantor of
whatever deal is reached, whatever the obligations are, and there will be some bilateral obligations between the United States and Russia, which they will take care of through their own long history of negotiations and national technical means and all sorts of stuff. So that's not where the guarantee comes in. Where the guarantee is important is that China guarantees, is a guarantor of Russian compliance, and that gives Ukraine a degree of assurance that Russia will comply, because the implications to the relationship between Russia and China, I mean, it wouldn't be a cost-free thing for Russia at all to ignore such a guarantee from China. Nothing is foolproof, but I think that's that's an example of something that can be looked at in the context of a negotiation. And I think all the experience we have of frozen conflicts is there's an example of a disaster for Ukraine. Those areas of frozen conflict are frozen. There's no economic growth. It's stagnation, young people leaving. And Ukraine, and that would rule out, it would rule out entry into the European Union, and it would rule out membership in NATO.
Right.
So we come back to, and it's all very well to say, oh, negotiations aren't going to lead. Once we move off the maximalist demands, which both sides have to move off if there's going to be a negotiation, and which we can test Russia on very quickly, because if they say they're ready to dialogue, and then the back channel reveals that they're not willing to move on anything, well, then we'll know that they're not willing to move on anything. But that has not been tested. And so I think that before we go, I think that the worst scenario for Ukraine is military collapse. And no matter what rallying cries one has about existential threats and how they've got to fight to the end, the tide has turned against them. So the worst case is a military collapse, which in fact would still lead to a negotiation. It's just that because of all these things that Russia needs dealt with, which can't be handled just by occupying the territory, and even occupying it would be a horrendous, a horrendous problem. But the worst case is a military collapse. The second worst case is a frozen conflict. So what Ukraine needs, and as I said before, politically they need help here, because the public is not going to get behind. We actually don't know what the broad public feels like, but we certainly know that there's a huge, right-wing constituency against any shred of an attempt at negotiating. So that's where we need. It hasn't been tested yet. All of the Western statements, Russia won't negotiate, Putin wants everything, that has not been tested. through negotiations. And in fact, in the first negotiations that took place early in the war, when it looked like, when everybody thought, you know, it was a walkover for Russia, there were concrete proposals put on the table, which were the basis of a negotiated settlement that would have compromises on both sides, but that would assure Ukraine a future in the European Union. So
Right.
I implore the West to get off. I mean, and there are those in the West that see this, and I implore everyone to start thinking about avoiding the worst case scenario for Ukraine. You know, and references to fascism are no good, because this is not a global war. Ukraine's doing all the fighting. Ukraine's doing all the fighting because NATO and the United States know that there cannot be a war involving two nuclear armed peers.
Right.
So it's an entirely different situation.
Thank you, Peggy. Yeah, lots of insight there. I think a widely accepted position is that even in the context of eventual negotiations, each party will want to come to the negotiating table from a position of strength. And the problem we've seen at Project Ploughshares, you know, with the notion of a stalemate, is a scenario where we look 1 year from now. You know, maybe we hold a webinar, a similar webinar, you know, on the 3rd anniversary, and the front line has changed very little. The momentum on either side has changed very little. The belief in a military victory has changed very little on both sides, and the only change has been, you know, tens of thousands more casualties or an exacerbated risk of nuclear weapons use, for instance. But the stalemate remains sort of the same. So, which I say this to emphasize, you know, the question of when, if it is a realization that neither side will reach their maximalist goals, then it would follow, at least from that perspective, that the question of when is very critical, and that there may be such a thing as a futile wait period, where the only thing that changes really is not the conditions of the ground, except for the number of casualties. We're nearing the end, and I thank you for your patience. We're just a couple of minutes over. So I will give each of you one last sort of time at the floor, if you will. And I'll start with you, Seva. I mean, even in the context of the obstacles that you foresee, including for this year, 2024, is there something hopeful that you might see in the current state of affairs, you know, related to the conflict? Do you see a silver lining? Do you see a glimmer of hope that may lead to the resolution of this conflict? Or, which is fine as well, is this, you know, are we just in a very difficult situation that seems at the moment hopeless?
But despite everything I said, I do have some semblance of hope left. I think Chris is right. Russia has lost. It's unthinkable in some ways, but it has happened. It happened in Afghanistan. They didn't do very well in Chechnya. They are in some ways handicapped by the fact that Putin is in a bubble when it comes to strategy. So it is possible for Russia to, you know, if not lose completely, then at least fail to gain any of its objectives. And I think the best way toward peace is, again, to allow Ukraine to defend itself. That's the language Russia understands. That means a clear plan for the country's future, long-term security guarantees, EU accession, NATO membership. That's what will determine the peace in the long term, the level of Western support. And that's what gives me hope that those forces will prevail. Okay,
thank you. Chris, are you nervous that Western support will decrease or wane or disappear altogether, and that this will change the conditions on the ground?
Yes, I am, and it's vital for Ukraine to continue the fight. And we see, as I said, you know, the fact that the U.S. has not provided assistance has disadvantaged Ukraine on the battlefield, and the Russians, because of their assistance from the arsenal of autocracy by DPRK, who provided 1 million rounds, they are making advances. So, but to your previous point, Russia has lost in the sense that Putin is an opportunist. He saw an opportunity in Crimea, and he tried to push his hand further and made a grievous mistake. Russia is now confronting a strategic situation that is far worse than it was at the beginning. With Finland and Sweden members of NATO now, and it's great to have Sweden and Finland part of NATO. the Baltic Sea is now a NATO lake, right? There was a challenge before that in terms of how do we protect the Baltic states, including Latvia, where Canada is the lead EFP nation for the NATO brigade there. How are we going to defend the Baltic states in case of an attack by Russia, right? Enormously complicated because of the anti-area and access denial that the Russians had in that area. With Sweden and Finland, that issue is much less of a problem. And I would also say the Russian military is defanged in the sense that they've expended their best equipment in Ukraine. And I think they're also proven to be relatively ineffective. I don't think you're going to be seeing major equipment sales by the Russians to its international partners anymore, because it's shown to be, the Ukrainians have proven that it can be attacked quite successfully. So, and of course, I'm completely impressed, as most people are, by the Ukrainians' ability to deliver the kind of damage that they have done to the Russian military. And I think they're only going to be able to increase that in the future as they get better equipment. So that, to me, the trend, it is, glass half empty or half full. Right. I think people are recognizing the stakes of this conflict are major. It will determine not only the security architecture in Europe, but perhaps globally as well. As we discussed, there's Taiwan out there. Let's not talk about borders in Africa or the Middle East, which make absolutely no sense. So I think when people realize the stakes, they need to ensure a Ukrainian victory at the best possible circumstance.
Thank you very much. And I think whichever way this goes, I would fully agree that there's a precedent-setting dimension to this conflict and the way in which we are able to resolve it. And last, Peggy, briefly, a middle power like Canada. Does Canada have a role to play in a major international conflict such as this one?
Well, I mean, I have to make a short response first, though. I mean, I'm very, very happy to agree with Chris on the point, the very, very important point about how much Russia has lost. I mean, it went into this invasion concerned about NATO, and NATO's strength and NATO's cohesion is much, much greater than before the conflict. And the loss of the neutrals, Finland and Sweden, is huge. And that's not going to be taken away by a negotiated settlement. And but I emphasize that we've had a year of stalemate, not the same amount of territory. Russia holds the same amount of territory as a year ago. Ukraine has not gained any territory in that year. So I'm not, and that was a year when there was huge amounts of American in particular aid, military aid. So where this idea is that we need more stalemate, when now it's starting to shift against. And with respect to this bubble, the bubble comment, I mean, it is extraordinary what Russia has been able to do with the economy, given, the growth was more than Germany, and it's got sanctions, it's got massive sanctions on it. So the idea that he's somehow he's a formidable opponent. So coming to Canada, Macron's words are very important, and Macron has been one of the ones that's pushed negotiations earlier than others in the past. And I think that's a very important, a telling point, his concern about the tide really turning against Ukraine, and therefore very, getting behind. He hasn't said this, but hopefully he will start to talk behind the scenes to others in the West about getting behind a negotiated settlement. And Canada could play a key role in that, but we won't. And just like we didn't in order to prevent the conflict in the first place, because of diaspora politics in Canada, because of the role that the Deputy Prime Minister plays in them, Canada has ruled itself out of any constructive way of negotiating the best possible settlement for Ukraine to guarantee its future.
Thank you, Peggy.
I'm very sorry about that. I regret that very much. And it doesn't mean we don't keep trying to get Canada to play a more constructive role, if only behind the scenes.
Right. Well, I mean, thank you so much for that, and thank you as well, Seva and Chris, for those last comments, and indeed for all your very insightful perspectives throughout the webinar. It's time to adjourn now, but and I will not attempt to to summarize, but I think if there is one point on which there is apparent consensus is the fact that right now conditions would not seem to be ripe for negotiation. I think that's an unfortunate conclusion from this conversation. But conditions are not just they don't just happen. I would say oftentimes conditions in international politics and international conflict resolution, conditions can be created. So one hopes really that it's not really a matter of being spectators to this conflict, but from the international bodies such as the United Nations to political leadership in the West and the East and elsewhere in China to recognize the limitations of this conflict, the high humanitarian toll, and hopefully create conditions under which it can come to an end sooner rather than later. Thank you, Ambassador Chris Shapardanov. Thank you, Peggy Mason. Thank you, Seva Gunitsky, and thank you to all the participants who joined today. You have a
Thank
great
you
day.
very much.
Thank you.